You are tuning in to Access Live, a show about raising awareness, what's going on in the community, and to address the issues that impact youth and their families that have serious emotional and behavioral challenges. We are located at the Brookins Building at 1776 East Washington in Urbana, Illinois, and at the downtown location at 202 West Park Street.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Access Live, a community education and engagement arm of the Access Initiative. I'm your host, Imani Bazell, and am so pleased to have in the studio with us Representative Danny Davis. And even though he doesn't live in these parts, we claim him anyway, because we only got a few. We got to claim family wherever we can, right? Welcome, sir.
Well, thank you. Thank you so very much. And I can tell you, though, I've got so many people that I grew up with, went to school with, who came to Champaign-Urbana to go to school to do master's degrees and doctorate degrees, and they stayed. So there's a whole little enclave of individuals that I know who've been here, relatives and friends, and it's a great place, quite frankly.
Well, we're trying to make it a great place for everybody who lives here. So I'm sure your friends are going to help us make it even better. And so, given that, we know it's stump season, right?
It sure is. It is indeed.
So as you go around and as you talk to others who are on the campaign trail, what are the primary topics that the campaigners feel they need to touch, specifically as it relates to the wants and needs of the African American community?
Well, let me tell you, one of the things that we always must realize, I think, we've made as a group, African Americans, a tremendous amount of progress, but we've also fallen short. And there are so many disparities that still exist in terms of education opportunities. I had a young lady call me the other day who was in college, but she'd gotten locked out of her dormitory because she couldn't pay all of the fees and she just didn't know what she was going to do. We worked on the plus loan situation for 2 years because we've lost so many students whose families can't qualify with the new regulations. And
my family couldn't afford to pay a dime if it wasn't for what we used to call, what are now Pell Grants, we used to call BEOG, and then if that wasn't enough, SEOG, the supplemental. Indeed. I would never have gotten a college education.
Well, it's just going up, 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 and so we need to figure out how do we make college or higher education more affordable, especially for middle and low income individuals who struggle, or when they get out, they owe $100,000, $150,000, some people $200,000.
That's right.
If they can borrow the money. So there's a great need to deal with that, but we also have got to do something serious about job creation.
Yes.
The movement of jobs out of this country. And that's why it amazes me when somebody's running, say, for governor of Illinois, and they have a great history of outsourcing jobs to other countries throughout the world. Or they have taken some approach and hidden some of their money in the Cayman Islands or someplace else when there are struggling community banks that could make great use of that. There are credit unions that could make great use of that money. And so I think we have to be aware. We've done quite well when it comes to health care in the state of Illinois, much of it due to the fact that we had a governor who was willing to expand Medicaid.
And a president who paved the way.
And a president who pushed hard to get the Affordable Care Act passed. Let me tell you, I've done a lot of things in my life, but working up front I serve on the Ways and Means
Yeah,
Committee.
ooh, that's
and
a big one.
we had a great deal to do with writing
Yes.
the Affordable Care Act. And there were provisions put in there that, I mean, I was ecstatic when money went in for prevention,
Yes.
health promotion, for home visiting, for community health centers, for individuals who had never had, say, a regular physician
Yes.
in their lifetime.
Because that's really about how you begin to seriously level the playing field.
Oh, without a doubt. We have so many health disparities until it's not funny. And that's because people start off, in many instances, without having access.
Yes.
For example, we still have many children being born to parents who are parents too soon,
Sure.
who didn't get the proper education, awareness, and understanding to know how to plan their families and plan
So
for
let let me stop you there. Now, this becomes the question. During campaign season, as people are making us promises, as we think about what kind of promises do we want made and kept as an African American community, we do know that health care, as you just described, is critical. You also made mention of education. I'm going to assume we're talking about public education.
all forms of it, actually.
And so what I'd like to get to is this question of public accountability is actually what I'm after. And how much is available in the public square, because as things get privatized, they become much more murky. There's we don't have the opportunity to demand transparency. And so, okay, we have kids having kids. We know that that's a problem. We do know the statistics tell us that teen pregnancy is going down. But what I want to get at is how do we make sure we're not blaming the children of those parents? And once you are born in the United States of America, do we want to make the public promise that we will level the playing field in a way that this child born into these circumstances has the same life chances as a child born in much better financial and stable circumstances? How do we make sure that happens? What is it we should be calling for, sir? And how do we as a Black community understand policies and practices that get us closer to that kind of equity?
Well, we know that public education has been the greatest equalizer that has existed in these United States of America. And yet we have individuals who are trying to skew education towards private schools,
Yes.
towards charter education, towards anything other than every child having access to the highest form of education that we can provide for them. We have an individual, for example, running for governor of the state of Illinois, who has already made it clear that he would like to see the minimum wage
Yes.
reduced. How do you reduce $8 an hour?
How do you even
People
get
who
lower?
work all week long and at the end of the week have not earned enough money to have basic necessities of life met. And you're going to tell me that people would consider voting for this gentleman?
So that's one thing that sounds important. What I hear when I talk to our listeners is that they want jobs, jobs, jobs.
No doubt about it.
And so how do we get those? And if you honestly work full time, what's the minimum we should be able to expect? What should we be holding whoever gets elected accountable for?
You should have a livable wage.
A living
Plus,
wage.
we-
Y'all heard that?
We have to remember when situations were similar to what they are today, there were people who stepped in and stepped up with some forms of public sector employment.
Correct.
And I'm one of these individuals who's willing to promote that, because my theory of economics is that if you've got people with money to spend, that money is going right back into the economy.
Yes.
And it is circulating around so that the economy is moving. If you've got too much money stacked up
Yes.
in the hands of too few people, the environment becomes stagnant. I mean, that's what happened to us when we had the big meltdown
Sure.
and letdown. Banks and financial institutions and mortgage companies had let people have real estate knowing that there was no
But
way.
they weren't trying to do anybody any big favors,
It was no-
correct?
that's
They were
right.
making cash money off of
They
that money.
were making money head over heels and just getting fat. And people often talk about forms of warfare,
Yes.
class warfare. Well, let me tell you, if you're at the bottom of the barrel, cannot feed your family, cannot have the basic essentials that are necessary to live a decent life, you can call it what you want.
Yes.
I mean, but
I
unless,
call it class warfare.
unless it changes. And, you know, I've got some friends who've told me that they were considering voting for someone other than Pat Quinn in this election for governor. And I say to them, have you ever seen a turkey vote for an early Thanksgiving? and I'm telling some of my friends, and some of them are clergymen, some of them are business people, some of them are individuals who feel that somehow or another, and they say we got to have a two-party system. Yeah, we got to have a two-party system, but first thing we got to have is a system that looks after the interest
Yes.
of all parts of the population. And so when you downsize, privatize, outsource, send jobs across the country away from people who need them into other places so that your corporation can make more money, I don't think that's operating in the best interest of people in the United
we
States.
see that it backfires. So two things. One, I think I hear you saying that to keep people poor, to keep people living on the edge, is actually bad for the economy. And two, I want to say, of course, now that we've mentioned a political party and someone running, Governor Quinn's opponent is welcome to come on the air and make his case to the African American community and our allies who listen to this show, and reap whatever rewards or punishments are in for him when he shows up. So, Representative Davis, jobs, I hear our people saying jobs, quality, affordable higher education, but first, quality prenatal care, pre-K, quality public education. And then there's this question of housing. One of the things our people say they've seen is that some real mistakes were made building these huge high rises of public housing. And the psychiatrists helped us figure out how bad that was, and they've been coming down.
Let me tell
and that's
you.
a good thing. But the problem is, if you tear down 200 homes and you only replace them with 100, where are the other 100 supposed to live?
Until recently, I had more public housing in my congressional district than the rest of the state of Illinois combined.
I believe it.
I mean, I had Robert Taylor, Henry Horner, Stateway Gardens, Rockwell Gardens, all kinds of public housing. Much of it is gone, but
Yeah.
so is the population.
Right.
Because the replacement was basically 3 for 1.
Yes.
You demolish 3, you rebuild 1. Where did the rest of the people go? Well, they've had to go someplace, and they've had to leave the communities that they've been accustomed
So any
to living
stability
in.
they might have had
They
got
haven't
washed
had it.
away.
And there were too many people, obviously, just
Sure.
in too little space. Another big issue, though, facing the African American community, beyond all of those that we've already touched on and talked about, is the whole question of our complex criminal justice system, where we have more people incarcerated in the United States of America than any other country in the world,
And we want to call other governments repressive.
including China and India, countries with populations that will dwarf ours.
Sure.
And of course, a big segment of that population are African Americans.
Yes, they are.
We make up only about 14% of the population overall, and more than 50%, about 51% of the people who are incarcerated are African American.
And we have to ask the question, what's wrong with this picture? And so then here's the other thing we get. So we know the health care and healthcare access, we know, which includes prenatal care, pre-K education, K-12, access to higher education, access to quality affordable housing. Then we come to the issue of policing. And the policing of the African American community, which leads straight to the statistics you talk about, that we are extremely overrepresented in the jail and prison population. Currently, we turn on the television any time of the day for the last 3 weeks, and we see the question of Ferguson. And we know Ferguson, Missouri actually isn't even about Ferguson, Missouri, is it? It's about policing. Talk about that.
There are Ferguson, Missouris all over the country, including even in big urban places like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Detroit, Cleveland, wherever you go. If you ask African Americans, what do they consider to be the biggest failure of our governmental structures?
Yes.
It's the notion that there is equal justice under the law, and everybody would like to experience it.
I'll pay for what I did.
Yeah.
But, you know, don't be starting something and then I end up paying the price. So what should we be asking for or demanding from, as a lawmaker? What do I want to ask from you? I need you to teach me what we should be saying. One, of course, when you got 67% of the population and you're not represented in elected bodies, one, of course, we know there's an old boy network operating, but there's this very loud secret that says we're not registered and we're not voting in the numbers we should. So say something about African American voting, and then what is it that we should be demanding of law enforcement so we never see what we just saw in Ferguson, Missouri?
We also have, as we demand, we have to make use of our power potential to be in a position to do something about it.
Yes, sir.
That is, if we are agitating but don't do anything about it, there's nothing as potent as a voting community that is registered to vote, understand how to make judicious use of that vote, and being in a position to say, you will either cut us in or we will cut you out.
So registering to vote and voting is a critical, it's power.
That's power.
Now we heard something interesting. when people on the ground in Ferguson, and I think as a result then all over the country, started walking through these crowds with voter registration forms, there was actually an outcry from a certain segment of the U.S. population saying, that's foul, that's dirty pool, that's bad. Why is it bad to register people who are frustrated and angry with the system? Why is it bad to tell them they should vote?
Let me tell you, if you're not engaged in the voting process, I believe that you have abdicated or given up or given away a good part of your citizenship responsibility. In a free and democratic society, each one of us have as much responsibility for what goes on as any other one of us, meaning that if you make conscious use of yourself, you determine who the police superintendent or police chief is. You determine what the hiring practices are. I mean, even in Chicago, where I come from, there is a great disparity relative to the number of law enforcement officers who are African American and the African American population in the city. But we've gone all across the country holding hearings on law enforcement misconduct, and it's the same thing whether you're in New York, whether you're in Los Angeles, whether you're in Oakland, whether you're anywhere, Cleveland, Detroit, it's the same thing. So this focus, and some of us are saying that, you know, Ferguson really can become the spark. That just like Emmett Till became the spark for civil rights legislation.
Well, let's hold on to that spark while we take a very quick break, and we'll be right back.
Access Live can be heard every Wednesday afternoon from 2 to 3 p.m. on WBCP 1580 AM in Champaign-Urbana. You can learn more about the Access Initiative by visiting their website at www.access-initiative2.org.
And we're back. This is Imani Bazell, your host for Access Live, a community education and engagement initiative of the Access Initiative. Again, we are so pleased to have in the studio with us today Representative Danny Davis, who is in Champaign-Urbana visiting us from the great windy city to the north, Chicago, Illinois, who try to get all the resources all the time, but we're going to talk him into sending some down here. I know I wasn't supposed to say that part, but I'm in charge of the mic, so.
Right on. Well, let me tell you.
He says, okay. So, before the break, we were talking about something very important. I asked you, I've been asking you, what should we be asking of? What should we be demanding of our elected officials? And we went through the litany of health care. We talked about housing, public education, access to higher education. We got to the question of the outrageous racial disproportionality and disparity in incarceration, and we took that back to the question of policing and talked about Ferguson, Missouri, and how can we afford, how can we ensure that not happen again, which got us to voter registration and voting. And you said you all have been going around the country holding hearings to allow the people to speak. What are you hearing the people say about policing? And can you name a few things our audience should pay attention to when we say this is what policing should look like? Because right now it looks like martial law.
Well, I think every place that we went, Representative Greg Meeks and I, Greg is from New York, and we co-chaired a task force of the Congressional Black Caucus dealing with law enforcement misconduct, is what we called it. And every place that we went, we heard the same thing. But at the bottom of all of it, if you have an activated community that is registered to vote, who understand what their rights are to go along with the responsibilities that they are taking, then change can come. But we also have to realize that it's not a project. It's not
Yes.
something that you do for a few days or for a week. There's an old saying that freedom is a hard-won thing.
Yes.
Each generation must win it and win it again.
It's
And
a
so
long distance run.
it's forever. I mean, you can't give up. You can't stop. I mean, the sermons that I've heard this morning
Yeah.
at the churches that we attended, both ministers have talked about not giving up and knowing that change can come. But you've got to be engaged. Education, registering to vote, listening to what is going on, knowing when to checkmate elected officials.
Yes.
I tell the people that I represent, you know, if you don't think that I'm representing you, then I ought not be your representative. You ought to vote me out and put somebody else in. It's your responsibility.
It's our not just our
to
right,
do
but
that.
responsibility.
It's a responsibility.
And it's you know, especially folks who look like us. There's still blood in the streets
And
that
never
represents that responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, this business of who's going to be governor, who's going to be United States senators, do you know, and I'm not just a partisan, although I like being a Democrat, and I like being characterized as a progressive or a liberal. Let me tell you, some of my colleagues on the other side put amendments on the floor to the agriculture bill that said
Yes.
things like anybody that's been convicted of a felony should never be able to get food stamps during their lifetime. And if members of their family are receiving food stamps, they should be re-evaluated for the purpose of reducing their allocation. So we got to know.
So whatever you've done, they're essentially saying whatever you did, you get a life sentence for it.
Millions of people are serving those life sentences right now. And it's not just a few people, anything. We're talking about 15 million people. There are many companies, many businesses, governmental agencies that once you've got a record, you can give it up. And so the recidivism is just over and over, around
Yes.
and around. And this plagues the African.
Yes, it does.
There are places in African American communities where if you meet 5 African American males walking down the street, 3 of them will have some kind of criminal record.
So let's seize on that for a moment, because I would not be doing my due diligence if I didn't transition us to a very big and important question and issue. These numbers of people, we know that in the United States, we incarcerate more people than anywhere else in the world. But there's a pattern to who we incarcerate. And so you've made it clear that there is great racial disproportionality and disparity in terms of arrests, in terms of sentencing. You also talked about many ways that they are life sentences. Here's the piece we need to talk about for a moment that I hope from the position you hold, you can help bring some of your best thinking to this conversation. And that is, well, 2 things. One of the other things we know about the incarcerated is that they're undereducated, right?
That's
They're
right.
coming from low income, poor families and communities. Many of them, a very high percentage of them, don't have a high school diploma. But here's the other thing that I need you to talk about. And I know you're so busy and you have to run, but here, correct me if I'm wrong. Are we or are we not using the criminal justice system instead of fixing a comprehensive mental health system?
Oh my God, we've got especially a referendum is on the ballot
Talk
in
about
Cook
that.
County, asking that we find additional resources. Even in the House of Representatives, our most fierce advocates were really Patrick Kennedy
Yes.
and Jim Rumstead, both of whom had some personal
Right.
difficulty. But you see, people who are mentally ill oftentimes don't have lobbyists. They don't have any money to
'Cause they're poor.
contribute to candidates running for office, or they're too sick to be, in many instances, that actively engaged. And it's a crying shame because we have closed down many mental health facilities.
And we were promised they were going to be replaced by community mental health centers.
And we got people who now just, and I happen to be a trained psychologist
Go
in terms
ahead.
of my background and what I did before I ever started running for public office and that kind of thing. And so it's almost criminal the way we treat the mentally ill. For example, in Cook County, the sheriff says that he runs the biggest mental health facility in the state of Illinois.
And he's right.
In terms of people who should be in treatment, but instead they are in the Cook County jail. And there's nothing they can do except house them. They're not equipped.
They're not equipped to
these
treat them.
individuals. So we have to be willing to spend the money, and we have to be willing to elect people to public office who are not going to just cut, because if that's all you do, you just get blood, and you got to be willing to generate the money.
Yes,
that's why these issues.
That's what I wanted to know.
You know, the Republican candidate for governor has said that he's not sure what he's going to do if he's elected relative to the state income tax. And there's some talk about rolling it back. Well, if you roll it back, then you don't have money to pay for any of these things. You can't get blood out of a turnip.
No, you cannot.
And you can't provide services without paying for them.
Is there any kind of legislation, white paper, anything like that? This will be the thought we leave our audience with, that we could get behind or that we could help shape, that would get us closer to that promise from the early 70s, that we might be able to recapture or capture for the first time community mental health services.
Well, we got to make sure that we elect individuals like Carol Ammons to the Illinois General Assembly and to other legislative bodies throughout the country. Let me tell you, if you don't have people in office who have a tendency to think a certain way, then you're not going to be able to do any of those things. I'm saying there are efforts to take the country backwards, not to move it forward. And we've got to make sure that we are diligent, that we have the fortitude and the understanding, say, to know the difference between a Pat Quinn and a Bruce Runner. I mean, if we can't figure that out, then talking about all these other things, you know, it's just sound and fury, signifying not much of anything.
Well, sir, if I could, I'd keep you here for hours and we would have it all figured out before we turn the microphones off. But it has truly been a joy having this short time with you this afternoon. I hope whenever you can make it back to Champaign-Urbana, that you'll come back and visit the Access Initiative and our wonderful, holding together by duct tape and burlap, Black-owned radio station WBCP 1580 AM on your dial and stream.
Well, I hope the community will rally
We gotta
around
support
and
this
form
place.
some kind of cooperative,
Yes.
or people will have an opportunity to invest and make it happen. I've seen co-ops, I've seen group activity And you know, when people bind together, it can happen. We make it real.
You heard it here, people. So with that, I'm Imani Bazell, your host for Access Live, a community education and engagement initiative of the Access Initiative. We were pleased and proud to have with us today Representative Danny Davis, doing what he can for us in Washington, D.C., doing his part to make sure the state of Illinois is responsive to our listening audience, to our friends and families. And I think the most thing that I take out of this conversation is that, as they say, democracy demands eternal vigilance. With that, I say adieu. Keep holding hands. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to Access Live. Access Initiative is a trauma and justice-informed system of care. We're glad that you joined us today. Please join us every Wednesday at 2 o'clock p.m. for Access Live. Thank you and be well.